Good morning. We apologize for switching the panels. Donna Reineck, she had a flight to get, and so we thank you very much for staying. And we thank Professor Albert Fischlo for his understanding. The others, we are the organizers, so we decided to make the change. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Denise Gregory. I am the Executive Director of the Brazilian Center for International Relations. And it's always good to be back to Washington, D.C., where I did my graduate studies at SAIS, Johns Hopkins, some 30 years ago. In fact, I am the first person in Brazil to undergraduate in international relations at University of Brasilia. And at that time, there was only the course at University of Brasilia. Now we have more than 100 courses on international relations in Brazil. And as Paulo Sotero and others came up with this idea, the interest for international relations in Brazil is growing, and is growing with the importance of Brazil. So it's very good to be there and to be part of this growing interest. I thank again the partners, Inter-American Dialogue, and Peter Heiken, Paulo Sotero, the host at Woodrow Wilson. You made a wonderful job in the organization of the event here. CEBRI and Prospectiva had the idea of coming up with this project. The project means a conference in Brasilia, this conference here in Washington, and we also contracted 2 papers, one by Peter Heiken. He's going to talk about the ideas behind this paper later on. And Pedro Mota Veiga, he's a Brazilian economist. He wrote about Brazilian economy, public foreign affairs, and his papers, both papers, will be available in our websites. CEBRI is 12 years old, and it's pretty young institution, and because the idea of studying international relations in Brazil was very inward looking, not outside. We carried out a survey for the first time in foreign policy with the elite of international policy in Brazil in 2001, and again now 2 years ago. And there is a book, it's called The International Agenda of Brazil. The book was written by a political scientist, Amaury de Souza, and the result is very obvious, but the result is there, is that Brazil's international role has grown in importance, and it will continue to grow. So the results so far of this discussion here, that Brazil is emerging very fast, the rise of Brazil is very fast, and it's continue to grow and continue to rise. It's there in this international survey. So the perception, both domestic and internationally, is that Brazil can contribute to global solutions on food, energy security, so I said here before, climate change, water, the Amazon. And Brazil is being invited, as never before, to any international meeting. So it independent if it's G20, if it's G8, the highly done process, G5 plus G8. Basic, a lot of coalitions are emerging, BRIC, IBSA, UNASUR in South America. In any letter, in any arrangement, Brazil is there, Brazil is present. The country, it was said here before, recovered very well from the financial crisis. In fact, it emerged with more weight and power. And Brazil lives a kind of magic moment. I told you that CEBRI is based in Rio de Janeiro, and it's a transformation in Rio because of this magic moment of holding the Brazilian Cup and the Olympics in 2016. As never before, international choices became a matter of domestic debate. Again, we can see this in this election. International issues were never a question of debate or reflection. And with CEBRI, with our think tank in Brazil, we can see that the interest domestically and international, we are being demanded much more than before. It was said here again that Dilma, probably the next president of Brazil in this election on October the 3rd, lacks Lula's charisma. In fact, she's tough. She's not the soft power person to deal with these international affairs and domestically. But independent of that, Brazil will continue to rise. Because of this Brazilian new leadership and responsibility that we decided to organize this reflection. We again invited Antônio Patriota, the General Secretary of Ministry of Foreign Relations, to do the opening speech in the Brazilian seminar. It was 1 month ago. And Pedro Mota Veiga, he talked about his conclusions of his paper, of his article. And his important message was that the Brazilian foreign policy with Lula included the political component. And it was very important. He stressed that very much, that it was maybe the change. Because up to 10 years ago, it was the economy, it was the commercial value that was there, that was present in the foreign policy. And we also invited Ambassador Sérgio Amaral, who used to be President Fernando Henrique Cardoso minister, and Marco Aurélio Garcia, Professor Marco Aurélio Garcia, who is the political advisor of President Lula. And both are working for the campaigns of Serra and Dilma. And we asked them about challenges, about present and evolving current policy. And it was quite interesting. Marco Aurélio Garcia stressed that with Lula, Brazil has gained this international visibility. And most important, it was achieved not combining economic growth with social inclusion. So it was very much stressed that, again, for the first time, this combined growth with social inclusion was achieved. Poverty was much more reduced in Brazil, and Ricardo Mendes talked about the emergence of this new social the middle class. Also, he talked about new principles. Besides the traditional foreign policy principles of self-determination, non-intervention, Lula added the concept of the policy of solidarity and non-indifference, and it was very much present, especially towards Africa. He increased the use of its soft power, development assistance, cultural ties, cooperation in Africa, and it can be seen by the increase in the diplomatic body of Brazil. Embassies have been established in about 40 countries, 40 new countries, and most of them in Africa. He also said, Marco Aurélio Garcia, we reinforced the ties with our traditional partners, with the U.S., with Europe, and new ties with BRIC countries, with IBSA and Mercosur and South America. We created UNASUL, and we helped to promote political stability in the region. On the other side, Sérgio Amaral, he came up with a lot of criticisms in some points of the Brazilian foreign policy, especially the emphasis in South-South relations. But in the end, what we can conclude, he said, is that Brazil engaged in so many initiatives, and everything is priority, everything is important, but the concrete results so far have been very few. Also, he criticized the position, the dual position Brazil regards democracy and human rights, being very soft with Cuba and Iran. And political values were not clear, were not transparent. So these main external fronts, they are there. We are negotiating all of them. And he worries very much about the sustainability, including the cost, the budget to pay for that. So how are we going to adjust high expectations to Brazilian capabilities? Well, my final point, and I will conclude here, is that regarding some questions that were pointed here, I believe that yes, Brazil will continue to see a rise in Brazil. We stressed it before, the rise of the Brazilian multinational companies. That's a new phenomenon. And the private sector, very vibrant. The private sector is there. But, and as never before, that's something that we hear all the time in Brazil, Brazil will have to make choices. And Peter Haken, in a very interesting article he wrote about the Brazilian foreign policy, he said that Brazilian has a disinclination to take strong positions. I like that word. But again, this time is over. We have really to make choices. We will have to take decisions and take sides. But priority is and should be, and again, we have to stress that, is on the domestic side. In this last panel, it was very interesting that they talked about the necessary reforms, urgent reforms on infrastructure, education, and reduce social inequality. So thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here, and now to ask Professor Albert Fischlo, who is also in CEBRI's International Advisory Board. So we are very proud to have him here. Thank you, Professor.
I will try to be brief. Let me start by saying, in the first instance, that we think of Brazil as an international power today because of its domestic economy. That if it had not been for the higher rate of growth that has been experienced over the course of the last 6 years, the question of Brazil as an international power never would have surged in interest. The second observation that I would make is that Brazil's interests at the moment are very much at the global level. In spite of all of the discussion about the relationships with Argentina, Mercosur, Venezuela, the UNASUR, etc., those questions really dim with regard to the thrust, because what Brazil very much is after, and this in part owes itself to Celso Amorim's appointment as foreign minister, is a position on the UN Security Council. And a large part of Brazilian policy has followed from that particular initial starting point. It reflects itself in the creation of IBSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa. It reflects itself in Brazil's hosting of the BRICS meeting as well last April. The effort very much has been directed in that regard, and the United States has been of zero help to Brazil. And in part, to understand the relationship between Brazil and the United States, it seems to me one has to understand that contradiction at the start. The additional aspect of that was the question of the WTO, where again there was a sense that the United States wasn't helping, and where Brazil made a great error. Brazil made the error of conceding to the relationship, to an agreement that would have ended the differences in the Doha round, but India and China decided not to go along. And so Brazil was stuck out there, and that is again something Brazil has not forgotten. That sense of being potentially deserted by its strong allies of the South is something that, again, is part of what is built in to foreign policy. And an additional element there is the question of atomic energy, where Brazil sees India going ahead, developing its nuclear capability, and the U.S. agreeing to it and having an agreement, whereas Brazil had to sign on to the regular agreement and abstain from it, and currently still having difficulties in terms of questions of access and the like. So I think it's important to understand that Brazil, in spite of this great emphasis on emergence, is very much frustrated in terms of what has happened at the international level. At the bilateral level, part of this has been taken out on the United States. The United States, in terms of FTAA, was an obvious target. And it is no accident that FTAA came right after the Cancun difficulties with the WTO, which is when Brazil decided to pull out and end that going on. It's the case that the U.S. Has been a diminished trade partner with Brazil. China today has a larger trade relationship with Brazil than the United States. So you've seen this great change occurring over the course of the last decade in this particular phenomenon. When Ambassador Shannon speaks about all the memoranda of understanding that have been concluded over the recent past, I can think back to the whole variety of efforts that were made in 1976 to have joint meetings of cabinet ministers with Brazil and the like, which rapidly disappeared when Brazilian development did not proceed as substantially. There is a certain danger because Brazil has given importance to international relations as a way to keep the left happy with President Lula. Lula had to do things domestically on the economy that no one was prepared to accept interest rates of 26.5% put out by the central bank, accept long periods of time when there was restriction on credit, accept all of that. And so the easy thing was to travel internationally. And so that became a way, and in part, it built upon itself, which is where the whole experience where Brazil saw itself as providing a solution, not merely with Iran, but also with regard to Israel and Palestine. The notion was that Brazil was stepping forward, and this was aided by what was happening, the differences domestically and the like. What I would say for the future is that much is going to depend upon the continuity of Brazilian economic growth. And there are some questions. The basic and fundamental question in the case of Brazil is you have a country still with a deficit in spite of all the discussion of primary surplus. You have a country still with a rate of investment of 18 or 19%, whereas China has an investment rate of 45%, and one has an investment rate of 38, 39% in India. Mm-hmm. And that is a very large part of what's going on at the moment. And you have demands within society. It is well and good to point out the rise of Class C, the new middle class in Brazil, which I am fully supportive of. It is another to look at the continuing pension obligations in Brazil. Brazil is one of the few countries that now spends something of the order of 11 to 12% of its income on pensions. And this is government money. And there is an annual deficit in meeting that responsibility. So you have a number of these kinds of questions that lurk below the surface. Dilma, when she takes office, will have a very difficult path to follow. For one, Lula is still in the country. And that makes it doubly difficult. For another, she has to respond to this large congressional vote that is going to be in favor of the PMDB, the PT, and find a way to prevent that from expanding expenditures even more. The ability to do that at a time when Meirelles leaves the central bank, the ability to do that at a time when people in Brazil are quite confident. There's a very strong mood in favor of what's going on, and there's a belief that manna does come from heaven, and that the there is a chance to do everything. The real challenge for Brazil is to assert priority. Mm-hmm. And it's to assert priority not only internationally, but also domestically. Because in the last analysis, the policy that Brazil wants to follow internationally mm-hmm. depends substantially on its ability to sustain its domestic growth. Thank you.
Well, I would like, I would like to follow Alfishlo, because I think what I have to say sort of goes in that same direction. I am not sure, Denise, if Brazil will be the power. I don't answer that question the same way. I am question mark. You know, having 300 of the best universities in the world, having been at the top of power in the world for 50 years, having well-educated people and a well-trained bureaucracy does not prevent you from making choices that cost you immensely in terms of your credibility and your national standing. And I'm talking about the United States. So if what's happening with the United States could happen, I am not sure if the Brazil's rise is inevitable. I don't think nothing is. I don't believe in the inevitability. I think what has happened, because as Professor Fishlow said, that Brazil, something has happened economically in Brazil. I also believe that the things that happen economically happened because there were some things that happened politically before, which had to do with democracy. Stability, political stability. It took us 10 years of fighting in democracy to manage to get to economic stability. And that's why this thing is so solid in Brazil. It's our national choice. And we built a lot on that. And we have the potential. We have always had the potential. Now, are we going to move to a new, a new level? What Ernesto said in his presentation, you project only what you are. We are a great country, but we are also a country where at age 15, 55% of our kids can read only mechanically. They do not understand what they read. We are a country that has infrastructure problems that are known. The airports of Pittsburgh or Charlotte beat Guarulhos any day. And I'm not talking about the 40 airports that China is building right now, each one of them twice the size of Dallas. So this is the world where we are going to compete. We have the education problem, that is obvious. There are, right now, if you know people, there are 130 jobs open in Brazil today for skilled manpower in various kinds. It starts with mestre de obras, which is a very low skilled, is the manager of a construction site. So I think that we have to reserve this answer. Are we going to rise? We are going to rise if we answer internally those challenges. I wrote something that will appear very briefly in a few weeks in something called Politics, is the journal of the UK Political Studies Association. And I was thinking about all those things and how Brazil can rise, etc. I think the current challenge, having in mind that the real challenges are the domestic ones. And I think I welcome the fact that after having two exceptional presidents, I think President Cardoso and President Lula are exceptional leaders in Brazil. I think that we are going now to have to test ourselves, because we will have run-of-the-mill people to lead us. And the country will have to assert itself. Will this famous song, Esta Gente Bronzeada, mostrar seu valor, we are going to have to show it now, our collective value. I think the immediate challenge for Brazil, we are in a different place internationally. I think Yes, not only because of the things that happen internally in Brazil, because of the things that happen in the world. The rise of China, the relative decline of the United States, etc. How we manage this, I think one major challenge right now is for Brazil to calibrate its international ambition, to its position in the global distribution of power. We have ambition, but we also have to identify what is our position in the current. This thing is changing. And Brazil, yes, is in all the G20s and everything. How are we doing that? I remember still about a couple of years ago that we wanted to be in the G20. And we absolutely said that we wanted to be in the G20. And then the crisis happened, and suddenly we were in the G20, and we were a member of the G20. And I remember people asked, so Brazilians asked, so now what we do with that? And we managed to find one area, I think Ernesto mentioned. It's actually a great friend of ours and a wonderful Brazilian diplomat, Marcos Galvão, who is a Deputy Minister for Finance for International Affairs, now headed, I believe, our ambassador to Japan. And Marcos is the person managing the relationship in the G20 with the other BRIC countries. And said, it's amazing what we are learning in terms of cooperation, in terms of consultation. Those countries are really consulting in detail about things, and we are learning on that. But there are things that are happening today that we are in a sort of uncharted territory. We are going to help build those institutions. We have challenges in Brazil beyond those that I mentioned, by the way, the education, the infrastructure. There are challenges of governance in Brazil that are very important. It has to is related to if we rise, how we rise. I really think that we are going to be tested and be challenged in areas like combating corruption, political corruption. A modern economy cannot function effectively with the type of problems we are having right now. And with that, we are going to have to, accountability has to come into the process. And all areas of governance, I think, are very important. They are very present, but nobody needs to tell Brazilians that. Those are issues that are very much there. One thing in relation with the United States, and we are going to have to resolve that. First, the framework, the Pew Center report that we released yesterday, very, very interesting, and has some information. First, the views about the United States in Brazil are very favorable. 62% of Brazilians have very favorable views of the United States. Very favorable views also of China, but it's not a majority. It's more on the below 50%. Now, actually, the only two leaders of the ones polled that get more than 50% of favorable rates is obvious Lula, that gets 150% right now. It's just way, no, it's 80%. Obama gets also a majority, close to 60%. All the others are below 50%, and there is one particular neighbor of ours, more to the north, that is the least liked leader. You know what I'm talking about. 13%. Those are considerations, because we know that there are people, in good people that believe that we have to maybe to Bolivarianize things. And I don't think there is much of a market for that in Brazil. Actually, the most fascinating finding of this, to me, this is really an amazing thing. Only 5% of Brazilians believe that the Brazilian problems are generated by forces outside of Brazil. 80% believe that politicians, corrupt politicians, are cause of the problem. And then the other thing that's absolutely fascinating, which gives me great hope, 55% of the people responds that it's ourselves. We create the problems. We contribute because we are accomplices in lots of things that go wrong. And I find this very, very positive. You know, I always tell in lecturing, etc., Brazilians, like America, we have a common trait here. We are capable of looking into the mirror. And you know, and we are self-critical. And that's very, very positive. Relations with the United States, I think, another thing that's important consideration, support for trade and free markets. 87% of people in Brazil think that's good. Ask if you're better off in a free market economy, 75% agree. So we have had sort of a more status sort of strand right now, and not only Brazil, by the way, lots of since the crisis, the 28. But I find it very interesting to keep this in mind. I think, thank God, this had a lot of repercussion this morning in Brazil. Global television carried this, and there are lots of messages here for the upcoming, the incoming government. Now there is an issue. There has always been a strand of anti-Americanism in Brazil. Okay, when Barão do Rio Branco shaped our foreign policy and identified the emerging country of the time, which was this republic, and decided that Brazil had to get closer to that for a variety of reasons, and especially to avoid the neighbors to gang up against us. There were reactions to that. There is a famous book by, what's his name? Prado, The American Illusion, A Ilusão Americana, which is, this debate has always been in Brazil. And we have had it, and we still have it. And I believe there is in Brazil today a discussion on, you know, are we rising? Is our rise, can we rise by ourselves? We rise in this world in relation to the United States, to China. How does it work? A lot of people in Brazil, including in the establishment, believe that there is a zero-sum game. That since we are the only emerging power in the area of the old hegemon, it's the idea that for us to rise, the hegemon has to come down. Actually, the numbers do not, if you get projections of GDP, Brazil is 2% of world GDP. China is about 8%. In 10 years, if everything goes absolutely well, Brazil will be 2.3% of world GDP. China will be 15, 16. China is the country whose rise really diminishes, forces, rearranges things for the United States and Europe. Relative importance in the world economy. If you pay attention to how China relates to, it's the harmonious rise. They are not challenging directly the United States. They don't need that. They don't want that. But they are the guys who really rise to the detriment of the United States, if you may say so. In the case of Brazil, there is no such thing. But there is a discussion in Brazil. For instance, I think that, and Peter reflected on that in other writings and statements he made, we picked and chose, we chose some issues in which we could somehow be in confrontation with the United States in Latin America, in recent times in Latin America. And the case of Iran also was clearly that. I see a case in which the Brazilian contribution could have been accepted. Turkey had we remember the lessons of Rio Branco, that in diplomacy you never celebrate victories. Had we created the opportunity and used the opportunity to remind Iran that that was an opportunity and that we were happy to help, but Iran had to continue to move, and I think that, and that may still work. because I think Brazil is still there, and we could still manage to be positive in that. But the current moment, and I think it's important to see whatever the outcome is likely, most likely, very likely Dilma Rousseff president, although a question that was really out of the game last week, first round or second round, it looked like a first round. The polls are moving. And now it's no longer unrealistic to talk about the possibility of a second round. I personally would like to see one for just one reason. The candidates have not yet had the opportunity or used the opportunities they have to talk about those issues we are talking here, about infrastructure, education, the real challenges. They are just, in this sort of celebrity kind of give and take, and many, actually, it is, the Brazilian people is not interested in the campaign. You can see that by the absence of stickers with the faces of the candidates in cars. People are not interested in that, okay, which is a contradictory. But I find that if Dilma is the president, she, I believe, has had enough engagement with the United States. She, I think, will focus on the economic side. And I believe that, she understands what the issues are. The question is, can she occupy the immense space, political space, that Lula will leave? The other question does Lula want the Dilma, who is his creation politically, to be successful? Will he understand that if she is successful, I believe he does, to help Dilma be successful, because she is not going to be the PT president, she's going to be our president. And if she is successful, that she, in 4 years, stay there, that we re-elected. Finally, on the Pew Center, another thing very important, you know that we have a reputation as machistas in Brazil, right? The poll says that, this was asked way before Dilma was ahead, and says, don't mind Dilma. Would you think that having a woman president is a good thing? 70% of Brazilians said yes, and equal proportions of men and women. Actually, if you take, and when they presented this, and they took the same thing with Hillary Clinton, and it was much lower. Now, a lot in the United States, it doesn't matter. But it's very interesting, I think the indications are of a country that is really changing. It's really confronting issues, but question mark on, are we going to rise? Are we going to do? And question mark on the relationship with the United States. Really, nothing is predetermined. It depends on what we are going to do, in the days and months ahead. Mr. Hakim.
Oof.
Did he leave anything?
I don't know if anything is left to say.
Now he's going to start.
Let me just say that everyone seems to be agreeing that Brazil has assumed an important role in international affairs. I think that was nobody sort of questions that. We've not even tried to define what an important role in international affairs is. You tried a little bit, Al. But one could really question, for example, whether Brazil is able to get its own way or simply able to block things it doesn't like, for example, at places like Doha or the FTAA and in South America itself. Is it a good blocker now, or can it really get its own way? But I think that there's reason to say that it's still one of the half a dozen countries that has to be taken into account in any international negotiation. There seems to be a built-in assumption that Al first questioned, I think he was the first one to question it, then Paulo came on, was whether this is going to last. One thing that is just so clear is how recent Brazil's rise is.
One could maybe start dating it when it was became part of the BRICS back in 2001. But even there, Brazil itself was totally surprised by being in that company of Russia, India, and China, I think. And it was much later, and Al traces it back to the last 6 years when the economy started expanding, and it really began to look like it was going to have a robust economic future, that Brazil began to really, and I think I agree with that. I think without that kind of internal development, internal solidity, I would go a little beyond the economy, as I'm sure Al would. I think, as Paolo suggested, the leadership of first Cardoso and then Lula gave a great deal of importance, or added to Brazil's importance. And I do think that the architecture and management of foreign policy did play a role. In other words, it didn't just emerge that economy turns into foreign policy influence. You mentioned it somewhat when you talked about Celso Amorim. I think that Itamaraty, Lula himself, all contributed to a different kind of Brazil. Let me just, Al did talk about Brazil must be frustrated at an international level. Let me just say, if Brazil is frustrated so quickly, I don't think it's going to be a very great power. If we're talking about in 5 or 6 years, all of a sudden Brazil doesn't get its way, it's going to take its marbles and go home, I think then, I think the question is, does Brazil have the staying power? And I think that if the economy goes well and the politics go well at home, I think that it probably will have the staying power. Sure, it's going to be frustrated. It's going to sort of bump around in its first attempts at. Let me say that what I think that, given that this is a new experience, I think being a world player, a world actor, I think it's very hard to make a judgment about where Brazil is going to be headed. We just don't have enough experience with watching Brazil over a few years and trying to play a role. It's trying to find its, and I think there are 3 or 4, maybe even 5, sort of really very important issues that Brazil is going to have to resolve. That I try to follow Brazil closely. I do it from here, not from Brasilia or São Paulo, but. Is Brazil at all interested in creating a integrated South America? Does this really have any real sort of strength within Brazil to do so? It seems to me that in order to do an integrated South America, which we hear a lot about, that means Brazil has to be ready to give up some measure of sovereignty and invest a great deal of capital and political capital in this. And there's by no means any sense historically that Brazil is really ready to make the kind of investment that real integration would require. That could be wrong, but my sense is Brazil wants a peaceful, friendly neighborhood that doesn't embarrass it when it goes out and sort of plays its international role, but to really call for integration, I'm not sure that that's in the cards, but we'll see. I mean, that's still a question, I would say. Secondly, the whole South-South, which just seems to be a nice ideological resting place for Brazil now, with being part of the BRIC, being part of IPSA, sort of trying to make summits with the Arab nations. Is this sort of a temporary way station? Is this simply Brazil is testing out? Or is this going to be a permanent part of Brazil's international politics? Or will we see a move toward a more traditional foreign policy, groupings, sort of dealing with those countries like the U.S., like China, like Europe, that really have a lot more perhaps to offer Brazil. Trade position, Al talked a little about this. I don't want to go into this, but I think that Brazil really would benefit among countries from a real international movement on the Doha round, on international trade with its huge agricultural production and trade. It's coming into its own on the oil and energy sector, and where Brazil stands. Will it continue to stand with China and India, or will it move more toward sort of finding a way to make a deal with the U.S. and Europe and move the Doha around? I think is still very, very much up in the air. There's lots of new issues on the table for Brazil, how it manages its energy resources. Brazil is already self-sufficient in energy, has found huge oil reserves. The management of those will make a tremendous difference for the future of Brazil. The whole issue of climate change, it may be an internal problem, the Amazon, but the Amazon, lots of different interest groups are going to be squabbling and fighting over the Amazon, and how that works out. And the U.S. doesn't have a policy now, so it's hard to know whether there's any cooperation there possible or not. But I think this will emerge as a bigger and bigger, and where Brazil ends up on this is uncertain. And what I think is probably the most important in terms of its relation with the United States, I think all of these affect its relation with the United States, is where its nuclear program is headed. There's sort of a vision that the way many Brazilian diplomats talk is nuclear is you're either going toward a weapon or you're not, you have no plans to do so, and it's an off-on situation. And the fact is that countries move along a path and they acquire certain skills, talents, technology, and they have to keep deciding each time as they move along this track whether they're going to continue and get more sophisticated and more. And, you start off, Brazil is now trying to enrich uranium, will be to a 4% level or so to use in an atomic reactor. Then the next decision, do you enrich to 20% to use in medical? And then do you begin to think about showing you have the capacity at least to enrich for, and so there's never an on-off switch. This is a continuing path, and I suspect this will just become a very big choice and an issue for Brazilian decision-making. And like I said, on all of these issues, there's the U.S. has a very strong interest as well. And I think what we're going to see with the U.S. is inevitably the Brazil and the U.S. bumping up against each other. We're already seeing it at the Cancun meeting of Doha and subsequent meeting, more recently with the Iran, which was probably the most serious. And there, Brazil, if it stays at this sort of global, influential, global profile level, is inevitably, that happens to every country that has some level of influence, authority, power in international affairs. They bump up against the United States, seriously, more seriously, less seriously, and it's going to happen with Brazil. And I think we should be prepared for it. Ideally, of course, I can't at this moment, although at the outset of every U.S. government there's always talk about a strategic relationship, a strategic partnership, and then a year or two later there's a great disappointment, and how are we going to deal with Brazil? I think, though, there needs to be some kind of better framework for dealing with issues like Iran, like climate change, like trade, that don't that help avoid conflict and maybe take advantage of opportunity. I was a little disappointed, frankly, with Tom Shannon's talk about a whole series of collaborations, which seem to me very modest and very minor, given the kind of bigger issues that are really on the agenda of both countries. And it seems to me we're not going to get from the smaller efforts at collaboration to the bigger issues. I think that they have to be dealt with. In other words, Brazil and the U.S., just the way India and the U.S. sat down and talked about nuclear energy and nuclear programs, and they came to an agreement, whether you like the agreement or not. Brazil and the U.S. should be talking about that. They should be talking at that level and not be talking about this sort of what kind of educational exchanges would be useful, frankly. Let me just say that I think that a lot of this will be up to Dilma. Will Dilma be her own person? On foreign affairs, she has to be. These are choices that have not been made by Brazil. Somebody has to make them, and she's the one that they're going to fall to. So I think that Lula will, in fact, disappear from the scene. She will be in charge, and she will have to manage this.
Wow. Thank you very much for the very good comments. Before Paulo makes his comments, I think we could take one or two questions from the audience. Okay. Questions. Please identify yourself.
Rodrigo Valderrama, Plantation International. This question is for Professor Fischlow. You mentioned the 11% investment in social services in Brazil, almost on a cautionary note, but isn't it absolutely necessary to maintain the solidity of the internal economy too, and the consumer purchasing power?
Do you want to answer now? Do you want to get another question? It's better, yes. Okay?
Just say yes.
Yes, here first. Yes. No.
Hugh Schwartz. First, I want to thank the panel for an extraordinarily provocative and illuminating presentation, all the members. I do have a question. Attention has been given to the importance of the domestic economy and the failure of it to grow even more rapidly given the not significantly changed levels of investment despite quite a few stimuli to investment. Now, Peter Hakem made mention of the possible gains from oil resources offshore. And in earlier panels, they talked about other energy contributors to the Brazilian prosperity in the period ahead. Now, given the experience of a number of nations, really other than Norway, of the Dutch disease phenomenon, of success on energy and resources being a drawback to the rest of the economy, with the rest of the economy now already having its difficulties in deciding how to manage problems to move ahead, what would be the Brazilian manner of coping with some successes, further successes on the international natural resources explosion?
Miguel Diaz, Congressional Staff. I know there's a risk in drawing the U.S.-Brazil comparisons too far, but I'll throw it out there for what it's worth. You can make the argument that when Washington emerged as a global power early in the 20th century, it did so hand in hand with an entrepreneurial class who was willing to step up and meet some of the domestic and international exigencies that existed at that time. And here I'm referring to the Andrew Mellons of the world, or Cornelius Vanderbilts that underwrote public universities and so forth, or to the Bill Gates of the world and the Global AIDS Initiative. I guess you see my question coming. Where are the Brazilian Andrew Mellons and Bill Gates of the world?
One more, and then we come back to the audience. Here. Yes, this is sir.
Some of them are helping Harvard.
Thank you.
Within the regional, David Atkinson, Princeton, Latin America. Within the regional context, I would like to think that within the next 18 months there might be a rather important shift in mindset in Brazil, because I I think within the next 18 months, they will be able to drive conveniently to the Pacific. The road through Santa Cruz will be opened up, and through Cruzeiro do Sul. Will that affect its vision of its integration within Latin America?
Okay, Paulo.
No, I would like just to comment on something that Peter raised. It's very interesting about Brazil in the region. I think, and evidence from what Amaury de Souza did for CEBRI, that study, another more recent. I think we have a discussion in Brazil about the elites in Brazil, the foreign policy elites in Brazil. Do we consider South America a good platform to project ourselves globally? I think there's a big question mark. I tend to respond on the negative. I don't think that we do. But, you know, this is something that
I tend to respond positive.
No, but I don't, the way we see the region. The other thing, there is a major, our diplomats are going to have, and our officials, and our intellectuals, that never engage in those questions. You know, we don't study. There are no experts in Argentina in Brazil, or in Bolivia in Brazil, or in Mexico in Brazil. We don't, although those are very important countries for us. And it's very difficult to do Brazilian foreign policy, economic policy with the neighbors, because there isn't really a strong constituency in Brazil internally to support that. There are companies in Brazil that are interested in that, but there is not a political. You go to Congress in Brazil and you talk about this, and people say, "What? Bolivia? Really?" And Bolivia is the longest border Brazil has. A very important country, not only because it's there, because potentially their internal stability really will depend increasingly on Brazil's prosperity, I think. But because if they don't do well, we already see the illegal immigrants in São Paulo. So it's in our interest. Are we going to, are our good university professors going to engage in this and explain to the country and get the ideological baloney out a little bit? But really engage in those questions. This is, I think, and it's a major challenge for diplomats in Brazil, because there is this problem of not having the constituency. And on the Andrew Mellons of Brazil, they're all there. We have more and more billionaires and millionaires in Brazil. The question is if we would get together and do a little changes in our tax code, because the Andrew Mellons of the world, they are not excellent because they are Andrew Mellons, because they had an enlightened elite in the United States that gave them the incentives to invest their money in education and to perpetuate their own memory, to immortalize themselves in those wonderful things. Like there is one just outside here, the Andrew Mellon, actually, hall, because it's public policy. Are we going to have that wisdom? It's up to us. You know, the question is there. Yes.
Oh, I go next? Okay. Let's start with the Mellon. In some ways, the emergence of private philanthropy is a very unique U.S. phenomenon, Miguel. You know, even next door in Canada, which is probably the country that has the closest cultural, economic system to the U.S., that there has never really emerged. Try to find the Ford Foundation in Canada. Try to find the Gates Foundation. They don't exist. I've tried. I know that. And, you know, because the government, you know, the government has a health system. The government puts the money in education. I mean, it's just a different way of organizing social, educational, cultural services. That, and so, you know, do we know any Chinese Mellons or Japanese? I don't think that that's a central issue, frankly. On the oil question, what will Brazil... When I first heard of that, I said, thank God Brazil didn't find the oil 25 years ago. Thank God it didn't find it 20 years ago. I think it's learned to manage its economy. It's learned how to manage, you know, a lot in Brazil, that I think it's in a position to do what a Norway did, what a Chile has done with copper. In other words, to manage it in a way that makes some real sense and doesn't just pour, doesn't create an island on a sea of oil like Venezuela did. I don't know what the impact of a highway through Bolivia is for Brazil. I can't imagine it changing things dramatically, but I can never imagine any dramatic change.
It's a terrible deficiency, Peter.
It is.
On the question of pensions, Brazil happens to have a higher payment of pensions as a percentage of income, public income, than virtually the OECD average. And you have to remember that the public pensions in Brazil are somewhere of the order of 10 times higher than the pensions received by private individuals in the case of Brazil. So you've got a system there which is operated very negatively. Indeed, I would argue that one of the first things that Dilma has to do is to take advantage of her majority in the first year, as did Lula in 2003. That was the first thing he did, was put an amendment to the Constitution to limit the amount that was being paid out. That would have gone up much more rapidly. So it is a problem. It is a problem because out of that public system, you're having a deficit. It's not being met on the basis of what people are paying in. Number two, on oil. On oil, everybody's already spending all the money and forgetting about all the investment that's necessary. The calculations that I have seen show that the net return to Brazil is negative through the year 2020. That is, that it will require more investment resources than the output over that period of time. Remember, we've just been through what's happened in the Gulf of Mexico. Remember that we're talking about going down deeper than was the case in the Gulf of Mexico. And the question of the technology and the capability of managing that technology is going to have to evolve soon. Petrobras is going out and will soon be selling shares, but the amount of investment that's required is enormous, and that's what makes me so worried precisely about having enough resources to deal with the infrastructure problems, to deal with the manufacturing sector in terms of continuing innovation. You have to remember one thing. The average tariff level in Brazil, which is currently for the industrial sector around 12%, is now higher than for India and for China. The inability to deal with that issue and that set of questions is out there, and I worry when you get excited about energy and you get excited about another subject and then another one, that somehow you lose a little focus. The final observation I'd make is that the relationship with China, as well as with the United States, is both complementary and competitive. China, as soon as it begins producing its automobiles that are going to go on electric power, is going to be potentially competitive with Brazil. And those cars are going to come to the U.S. You're going to see, you've already seen attempts to put up tariffs on imports of shoes, sneakers, and other products from China because they're sold too cheaply. You will have those kinds of pressures emerging, which are exactly the pressures that have historically emerged with the U.S. And it's the ability to deal with those things rather than saying it's south-south versus north-south that is going to make the difference over the course of the next years.
Okay, I think we are going to end this panel. We thank you very much, the participants, the heroes that stayed so long, and now it's lunchtime. I just want to add a final comment, maybe on this oil question, is about the debate we are having now on the role, expanded role, and size of the state. Maybe that would make a difference in the candidates next presidential candidate, not next president in Brazil. Paulo, I ask you just to say the final words in the name of all of us.
On behalf of the
Thank you.
Wilson Center, I would like to thank Denise, Peter, Ricardo for this great collaboration, all the participants, all the audience. Just a final thought about my hopes and apprehensions of what you discussed is that besides doing all the infrastructure, all the education, there is a very important detail that you guys forgot, which is that we have to build a soccer team to win the World Cup. And that is
going to be easy.
If we don't do that, I think we are going to have a problem. I was born the year that we lost in Maracanã to Uruguay 2-1, and the date was July 16th. And we cannot have that. I think that...
Birthday or
No. I was 2 months old. I was 2 months old, but I'm still traumatized by that event. So that's going to be the EXA, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you.